So, education is a process in which our academic and our social and cultural ideas and resources are developed. And this can be very specific things like calculus, trigonometry, US history, or it can be more general things like citizenship or an interest in knowledge and learning attainment. And education typically occurs in either formal or informal settings. And so for this module, we're mainly focused on formal education. That is education that is legitimized, that is an official system with credentials, a bureaucracy, and typically a set curriculum. And we're not focusing so much on informal education, which is a real form of education, but it doesn't have that same legitimization and perhaps standardization. And so here, education is where you're learning, but there's no formal structure. And usually, this is just the knowledge that we accrue as a result of our daily activities. So, questions I want you to think about as we're going through this module are how formal and formal forms of education include cultural transmission. What are the norms, behaviors, and values that are transmitted through formal and informal education? And how are they transmitted? And do we see a hidden curriculum that pops up? This non academic and latent socialization that results as a function of schooling and of knowledge attainment. And where do we see it? What do we find that is reinforced? That's part of like our national or our societal ideology, right? So, what about dominant culture values, colonization, forced assimilation, or even things about self discipline or obedience, being dependable or reliable, or about punctuality? So, think about all of these things as we move forward. So, to get a bit of a global view of what education looks like today internationally, and what some projected expectations are for education, right now you're looking at these projections for education rates relative to the growth of the population. And so you can see historically a bit here that we have seen a growth in people getting higher and higher levels of education. And in particular, when it comes to getting that upper secondary education and post secondary education, that we see that there is a lot more emphasis on the importance or expectations that people will attain these and also access to them. In the past, looking even prior to the time period that's covered by this graphic, these were kind of I guess, kind of beyond expectations of achievement. And like even just completing, um, primary school or lower secondary was seen as being like the norm. And so think about that. Think about how much education attainment has changed globally. Think about the comparison between US education level attainments to other countries that are of similar status or of varying stratification and status. And then also think about where we're going in the future. Why do you think that you are going to see some changes in the population and or levels of education going forward? The population is a bigger question, so you don't have to worry about that one. But why do you think like these changes that we see from 2016 moving forward? What's happening, and what do you think explains those? I think that this module may have some of the answers in your text, but maybe not all of them. So it's a good time to kind of brainstorm and try to do a little bit of foreshadowing. So I think that this is a good time to start jumping into those sociological perspectives. Um, so let's start with the functionalist perspective. Why do schools matter? Um, and what do we get out of education? What is the point? So, from the functionalist perspective, one of the things that we expect to result from education is that you're going to transmit culture. and that's both that formal and informal culture. That's going to include cultural capital and social capital as well. Through the education system, you're going to learn about societal norms and you're going to be socialized. And you are going to learn about like being a good citizen, about um, the expectations of you to be involved, basically, you know, in some activity outside of your home at least 8 hours a day. So you're kind of being socialized into this expectation of being a productive citizen who is working, right? Into how to listen to authority and follow authority. Um, and you're also going to be learning things about like gender, politics, and political integration, and sometimes even religion. Even though we live, at least in the US, in a country that, you know, suggests separation of church and state, it doesn't quite work the way that we think it does. But I digress. We still see that religion has a huge impact and influence on education, regardless of students and teachers' actual religious affiliation. In particular, Christianity has that impact. Um, and so, one of the things that, living around the world, that people often get a little curious about is kind of the exact like political involvement that we have in our schools. Um, and I think that many countries have copied this patriotism that we display in the US, that it wasn't like a day to day thing to show patriotism in schools until the example of the United States. And so, for example, I've seen places where it might be normal to, like, on a daily basis, sing the school song, right? But singing a national anthem, or, reciting the national pledge or something like that, a pledge to the flag, a pledge of allegiance. They're like, wait, you do that every day, like through primary school and things like that. And we're like, yeah, it was like an everyday acquaintance. You had to be there on time. You couldn't just like roll in the middle of that. And if you did, you had to stop, stop walking and stand there and put that hand on that heart and pledge your allegiance to the flag. And they were like, why? And I was like, I don't know, but we do know now. And that's a part of that socialization, of socializing us to be patriots who are showing a commitment, who are making a pledge to our country and our flag. Um, and other functions of education are, for example, the actual knowledge itself, right? That is the main function. Um, and then there can be some hidden curriculums involved as well. Those latent functions of education, those latent ideals that we learn about what's important, who's important, what's expected of whom, like what are girls expected to do as far as like educational and extracurricular interests versus boys versus others, if they're even acknowledged in school. And one of the important things that I've kind of skipped over here, that is related to the last thing that I said, is that in particular, when it comes to the function of education, it is typically very conservative. And what that means is that it is somewhat restrictive, and it doesn't allow for a lot of unique expression and what's the word I'm looking for? Expression or ideology. And so often people view at least K through 12 education levels as being a social reproduction of conservative ideologies and values, or dominant ideologies and values. In addition, we look at education as a form of social control. And you can see really directly some of the elements of it that are just like very blatantly about social control. So, for example, looking at standardized tests and how those provide social controls for what students should be learning. Looking at attendance expectations. This is one of my favorite ones, especially for like kindergartners, first graders. Um, because it is a social control, and it's not just a social control, having attendance or, pushing perfect attendance. It's not just a social control for kids, but it's also social control for adults who are responsible for getting those kids to school on time, right? Um, because nobody wants their kid to be like, I never get perfect attendance because you always make me late, right? And so that is really like a guilt trip that provides a control for parents. It's a social control through that conservative nature, for uniformity as well. And usually there are hierarchies that are in place where certain people in certain positions are authoritative figures, and by nature of that position, they receive deference or certain treatments and considerations, um, and are able to make judgments about what students can and can't do, and whether they should progress or not. Education can also be very much an agent of social change, and they can push for change. One example we're seeing on the news on a daily basis, we're seeing that students are once again and have throughout history been leaders of social change with protests. I think it's really interesting when they're starting to like kind of pull in this rhetoric of the um, like Vietnam War protests or Korean like involvement protests, and more recently, but still not recent. Looking at examples from fighting apartheid in South Africa and things like that. Students globally have often been at the forefront of being agents of social change. Because, I mean, it is a point where you're starting to meet people who are different and starting to see that some of that conservative nature that you grew up with has just been a social reproduction and not necessarily right. And so in college in particular, in university, in community college, in junior college, in 4-year, wherever, that's a time where people's perceptions get challenged and where they start to realize, other people aren't really that different from me, and they're not less human than I am. And people start to kind of fight for the rights. And at the same time, you also have a bit more freedom to do so without putting a career at risk, right? Without the threat of homelessness for your children or something like that. And so, really, students have always been huge, huge key agents of social change, but education altogether as well. Teachers are often rebels, who are working, undercover, a little hidden, to kind of lead the revolution, just like librarians. Also, if you want somebody who's radical, and revolutionary, go talk to your local librarians, because they are all about getting people the literature and the freedom of information and education. And so, yeah, education serves some really amazing functions. Sorry, I got a little long-winded here. I get really passionate about that. So conflict theorists are going to be doing the same thing that they always do, which is focusing on the inequalities and the conflict of it all, the struggle, right, for resources and for power. And education can be key to that. It can be key to overcoming it, but more importantly, or I guess more directly, it can be a key way of creating obstacles and challenges towards equity. So one of the most basic ways is whether or not there is access to education. And unfortunately, access to any education is not universal, not globally, and not even within our own nation. Access to education in the US, yes, we have public schools, right? But those schools are not equal, right? They're not equal in resources, they're not equal in quality, and they're definitely not equal in being staffed properly, having proper classrooms and things like that, or even in what populations they draw. And so, no, there's not really universal access to education. And a lot of this is related to capitalism, right? Education is economic, and it can be a profit generating industry. And so, um, especially as we start to see that schools are treating students more and more like customers and clients rather than just like citizens who are in need of socialization and knowledge. We're seeing that access, I believe, is going to continue to change and be a disadvantage for some. So when it comes to resources, definitely classroom size, textbooks, things like that, they matter and they are different. And some of that is just the nature of the institutions themselves, but some of it is also related to things that are highly correlated with the quality of education in schools. And that's things like family background and peers, right? These things are going to influence what the school is like, right? And influence what the resources are like for that school, right? Um, and that will influence one's future in socialization as well. Another thing that matters a lot here is the size of classes. It absolutely matters. Um, when you have smaller class sizes, there are less disciplinary problems, and studies show significantly higher graduation rates and test scores, right, with smaller classes. And particularly, this has a strong influence on success rates for lower income and lower status minority students. Private school versus public school, the schooling itself doesn't matter, right? Whether it's public or private, but the resources that are available do matter. And so if it's a private school with a lot of resources because of fundraising, because of tuition being higher or whatever, that is going to matter. The same thing for a public school that is located in an area with high property taxes. It could be, much better than maybe a mediocre or, a middling private school. So one of the things that they have seen though, because of that concentration of wealth with private schools, is that often private school students get more homework and do more homework, probably because they might have smaller class sizes, so their teachers can give and grade, assess more work. That they have a greater chance of enrolling in academic programs. And I mean, if you think about it, if your parents are paying your tuition, there's a greater expectation that you're going to be enrolling in academic programs. There's a greater chance that you can because you already have the financial resources supporting you. And so you don't have to worry about getting a job as soon as you turn 18, right? And they also take more college prep. Again, these other factors kind of weigh in here as well. When I was in high school, I did some college prep, but it was what I could fit in between going to school and having part-time jobs, right? Um, so they usually develop large amounts of social capital as well with private schools. And that's one of the key perks of a private school is gaining that information and knowledge of people, connections and things like that will help you to navigate social networks. So rubbing elbows, like sometimes we say and we mean it isn't what you know, but who you know, unfortunately. But really, differences within schools vary more than the differences between schools, is one of the things that we find. So, one thing that I wanted to point out that might be of interest to conflict theorists that we've already mentioned for functionalist theorists is that conservative nature of education. That with that conservative nature, with with that expectation, of this particular set of dominant ideologies and cultural values being transmitted, then that means that the ideas, the ways of performing, of thinking, of speaking, of writing, right? Of viewing some subjects as being more important than others is also going to be swayed, towards that. It's going to be skewed towards that conservative direction, right? And so that's where we get into some discussions about inequalities and how we look at history, right? Whose history is the most important? Whose history do you have to know, right? Um, and whose history is most valuable. So yeah, the conflict perspective, once again, may look at some of the same exact points and strengths that are mentioned in in the functionalist perspective through a different lens. So, one of the things that arises as a result of these functions and conflict theory and perspectives of education is a awareness of credentialism. And basically that just means that we have an overemphasis on credentials for status and job prerequisites. And it's like a catch-22 of equality, right? We live in a society where we claim that we are, judging people based on their merit, right? Rather than who they know and things like that. And so one of the ways that we set a standard is through these credentials, through licensing, through degrees and diplomas and things like that. And so on the functionalist perspective, on that side, they'll say that this rise of education or rise of credentials is a result of supply and demand, right? And so perhaps it's because we need a workforce that is actually more educated in the past. But on the conflict perspective side, we have to take note of the fact that we don't need high levels of education for every position, and that for some jobs, now in order to create that competition and stratification, we're requiring higher levels of education than previously necessary. Um, Another thing that we look at is how high levels of education means that you perhaps have been even more indoctrinated with the dominant ideologies, values, and beliefs. And so perhaps this is just a way of saying that you pass the acceptability test, that you're not just any fill in the blank person, but you are that fill in the blank marginalized or, disadvantaged identity with a degree, right? And so the degree actually serves as the proof that you have been through the social training that is preferred for the elites, right? For different positions and the class expectations that go along with them. Another issue that really leans a bit more towards the conflict perspective rather than the functionalist perspective is something called trafficking. Sorry, that's something completely different called tracking. So, tracking basically looks at schools as serving a function of sorting people and categorizing people, that they're sorting machines. And that this sorting, and here's where the conflict comes in, it sorts students into hierarchies and categories. And that tracking is a way of sorting students into different classes and different levels based on their aptitude and based on their interests. But it's pretty problematic. One is because there is really an overrepresentation of the most desired people in society in those higher college prep tracks. So, regardless of their intellect, regardless of their aptitude, there's an overrepresentation of wealthy, white, higher class people, right? And typically, middle and upper class parents in particular intervene and push for their kids to be in tracks that they don't belong in. They haven't really earned their way in, right? And this is a difference in values, right? Um, that we could talk about separately, make an appointment during my office hours. We could talk about the difference between working class values, middle class values, and upper class values. Does tracking, another thing about tracking is that the quality of teaching and materials may vary from track. I have a really crazy example from the tracks that appeared when I went into middle school, sixth grade. I lived in the public housing projects in Richmond, Virginia, not California. And as a result, the way that they tracked us from elementary school to middle school was really sketchy. So they focused primarily on where we were coming from. like on our zip codes, on the neighborhoods we lived in, because we were all being bussed into the school. And so if you were from some of the poorer neighborhoods, you would be expected to be in the remedial or the basic track. And then the students who were from the wealthier neighborhoods were expected to be in the higher tracks. And so I had a really interesting situation because while I went to schools and like on military bases before my family became impoverished, the last school I went to was in public housing neighborhood. And so while I had like straight A's in the fifth grade, they didn't count those the same because I went to a poorer school. They didn't think I'd be able to keep up. And so I was tracked into the regular levels of courses. And so, I mean, this wasn't shameful in any way, but it didn't reflect how they would typically treat a student in a higher class setting with straight A's. So I did luck out, and I guess luck out. I don't know if it was lucky or not, because I did have some struggles with this. But my sister went up to the school and pretty much demanded that they put me into the advanced level courses, which of course has its advantages. Um, I still struggled, like I said, but it wasn't because I was smart enough or didn't have the aptitude. It was mostly because I didn't have the resources necessary, like having a graphing calculator, right? The kids in those higher level courses needed them earlier, and they needed to have them at home in order to do their homework. And it was expected that we all could. And so I really struggled with that, with keeping up with those resources, with being able to go on the school trips and having the money to pay for them, right? Because again, this is middle school. You can't get a job yet, right? And you don't deliver newspapers in the hood. Nobody's getting a newspaper subscription, right? So yeah. And the other thing that was really messed up about it was that they didn't just track us, but we also couldn't use the same parts of the building. So it wasn't by grade level, it was by track. So if you were A track, that was the advanced, B track was regular, and C track were the people who were in remedial courses. And so we used different staircases. We went to lunch at different times. Like they didn't want the higher class students socializing with the lower class students. It was wild. Now looking back at it, I'm like, how did you get away with that? But it's something that occurs, and it's something that continues to occur in higher ed. One of the ways that we track, going into higher ed is whether you should be going to college, and whether you should be going to vocational school or something else, right? And not only that, California is a bit different, but at least where I'm from, there was tracking into whether somebody should go directly to a 4-year university, right? Or if they should perhaps take a pause and go to a 2-year first. It wasn't about saving money. Sometimes it was, but typically it wasn't about saving money. It was about, getting a chance to, um, you know, like get a bit of a head start before going into the 4-year, or to make up for any areas that might be remedial in one's education. And so yeah, it was so jacked up, so messed up. Another issue that arises with education is something called teacher expectancy. And this is really related to both conflict perspective and symbolic interaction. And so it'll probably be a bit more obvious once you hear what teacher expectancy is. You'll remember it from deviance, right? Way back when we talked about deviant behavior. But teacher expectancy effect is basically when teachers have higher expectations for some students versus other students. And in particular, when they are more likely to give more attention towards those students, or to be more positive and have more like affirming behavior, right? And it's where those students respond by meeting those expectations. So, what we're saying here is how much your teachers and your administrators expect from you may actually impact or have a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so think about it. Think about those different treatments that people receive, whether it's the tracking A, B, C, In elementary school, you had the reading groups, and now they do it in really slick ways that aren't as obvious as when I was in school. Like now they use colors that don't necessarily mean anything. Like you might be salmon versus teal. Which one's better? I don't know. Right. But when I was in school, they would use like you're in the turtle reading group versus the bicycle versus the sports car, right? Which is very obvious what's being said there. Or you're in the red group versus the yellow group versus the green group. And so I don't even have to tell you what those mean. You can see the symbolism there, right? And what that makes people think about their own aptitude, and in particular, children who are getting these expectations very early on. We can also bring gender into this, right? How do women and men, girls and boys, as a binary, receive different treatment and different expectations in different subjects? And, right, how do we kind of, through those expectations of a gender binary, kind of help to push children into molding themselves into that binary, right? What happens when you don't treat children differently based on their, the gender that they appear as? So yeah, we also call this Pygmalion effect and self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm going to give you a supplemental video as well that exemplifies this. You can just Google it or look it up on YouTube, and you'll find so many examples of teacher expectancy. Some are also related to race and ethnicity. So, for example, they'll show kids doing the exact same thing to teachers of different races and ethnicities. The kids are different races and ethnicities, and they'll ask which kids are misbehaving. And the findings are really depressing, in which they typically will suggest that the Black boy in the room is the one who is misbehaving, even if he's only doing the same behaviors as other kids in the room. And even if there's no misbehavior happening, everyone is behaving quite well, right? But they're just likely to be a bit more suspicious of the behavior of a BIPOC male child in particular. So yeah, it's kind of depressing, or very. So swinging back to the conflict perspective, and specifically looking at feminist perspective, we see that teacher expectancy, self-fulfilling prophecies, right, materializing in education. And we see especially that this is true when it comes to STEM, when it comes to mathematics and sciences, the hard sciences in particular, that these things are relevant. However, we also see that women typically have higher levels of academic achievement than men, or boys. Girls have higher levels of achievement versus boys as well. And some of this could be related to gender roles. Think about it. How could it be that gender roles affect this achievement? What are girls and women taught, right, about their gender roles that might make them achieve higher levels of academic success than boys and men? Girls are less likely to repeat a grade or to drop out of high school, right? Girls outperform boys when it comes to reading and writing tests, right? And if given the chance, if treated equally to boys when it comes to math, or in classrooms where there are no boys, girls score equally to boys in math, right? Girls and women attend college at higher rates. And the crazy thing is, despite all of this, their educational attainment doesn't necessarily pay off in the workplace. They're still paid less. What explains why women have this higher academic achievement? And what explains why they are, receiving less compensation than their male counterparts? Think about that. What is it? Send me an email, right? Write a comment in this video or whatever. Have a discussion about it. But what is it that's going on? I have some answers, and you might be getting some answers from your text as well. But I want you to think about it. We're getting to a point in the semester where my job is not to answer every single question I present to you, right? is to present those questions and to see if you can use your sociological imagination and approach them and attempt them. And finally, I just want to make a point here, and it's not necessarily reflected in the textbook, but I think it's really important, of looking at global trends in education and looking at how globalization has had an impact on education. So these were, in 2020, according to the Times Higher Education, the top universities in the world, right? Think about this, the world, right? The world is huge. There's over 8 billion people in the world. And the top 10 universities are all located in either the United States or the United Kingdom. What does that mean, right? What does it mean? Has globalization altered which education we view as being important, right? Or how has globalization really influenced what education looks like worldwide? Okay. Why aren't people from the US and the UK going to school abroad in other places? Is it because our educational systems are actually superior? I don't think so. I don't think that's it. Or is it because we get to dictate, right? And have historically dictated what education looks like. I mean, it's not like the UK or the US or its, ethnic groups created higher education. They didn't. Go Google the oldest universities, the oldest educational institutions, and they're not limited to and not exclusive to the Western nations. So what does it mean, right? And what does this list tell you about education? What do you think you can expect to see in curriculums? What do you think is important? Who's influencing it, right? So many big questions that you can get. And if you're really interested in this, go Google, go look it up, go look at these rankings. You can look at it within our country. Like, what are the top schools and why? What are the top majors and programs in the nation and why, right? What are we seeing reflected and whose interests are being reflected? All right. So until next time, we're going to be talking about religion, most likely next. See you. Hope to hear from you. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, take care.